All right, let's get going. Bow with me in a word of prayer. Our great Father in heaven, thank you for your holiness, and thank you for just how amazing you are and how worthy you are. Lord, we see that in the way that you established your law for the people in times of old, and just how much of it focuses on doing things exactly as you would have them done. And Lord, help us to have that kind of heart, that kind of enthusiasm for worshiping you and obeying you and doing things as you would have us to do them. And God, we are always just privileged and recognize the privilege that exists in being able to, as your people, gather together and worship you, being able to have that connection with you and that relationship with you where we can gather and know that we are the temple, that we are tabernacles where you dwell. Lord, help us to always appreciate that just as the tabernacle in times of old was built and maintained with a certain amount of respect and honor, that we should have that same kind of respect and honor in the way that we live our lives, knowing that we are your dwelling place today. Help us, Lord, as your church, to always be mindful of the way that we are to be the beacon of light to this world, that we are to be the place where the world can come and know that they can find you, and help us to live in a way that would make that so abundantly clear to the world, that to those that might be looking for you in this community. We love you, God. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, Exodus 35. Exodus 35. That's where we are this morning. Almost said tonight. Tells you how tired I am already. So, Exodus chapter 35. We're going to do 35 down through 40. I'm going to be out of town down in Florida Wednesday and Sunday, so Steve is going to be teaching my class. We'll be taking y'all from Leviticus 1 through Leviticus 10 is the plan, and, good luck. So he better not get me off schedule, because I have been on schedule for an entire quarter, and I'm super proud about that. So hopefully he will take that and run with it. So I just wanted to go ahead and tell you now, go ahead and read Leviticus 1 through 7, I think is Wednesday, and then 8 through 10 is Sunday. So just make sure that you're staying ahead of the reading so that you can participate in the discussion on Wednesday and Sunday. So Exodus chapter 35, I told my wife, I said, it's strange to me that we have this as an entire section for what we're going to study today, because there's literally one new thing that happens in this entire section. Because it is, in many ways, they did what we've already been told they were supposed to do. Right? Like, all of the rules and the specifics about the gold rings on top of the curtains and the gold bars that's going to hold the curtains and the post that's going to be the support for the bar that holds the curtain. All of these things that are very specific about the tabernacle that we've already had delivered to us in the text. It essentially goes back through all of those specifics and said they did this, they did this, they did this, they did this, they did this. But I do think that there is at least a point of emphasis there, and that they did what they were told to do exactly as they were told to do it, right? And it's hard to miss that point in the text, because you're reading it going, why are we reading all of these details again? Because it wants you to know that for instance, you start reading here, verse 10 of chapter 35, let all the skilled artisans among you come and make everything that the Lord has commanded. The tabernacle, its tent and covering, its clasps and supports, its crossbars, its pillars, its bases, the ark with its poles, the mercy seat, the curtain for the screen, the table with its poles, all its utensils, the bread of the present, the lampstand for its light with the utensils and the lamps, as well as the oil for the light. Like it's going to spell out every possible thing for us. And then you get a little bit later, and you start reading Chapter 36, building the tabernacle, it starts describing the loops again and exactly how the curtains were made and exactly how all of this came together. And like we said before, the support beams and posts and all of that sort of stuff. I think the point for us is they did what they were told to do. They did exactly as God commanded. Keith?
I looked it up this morning. I think it's 6 times in the Bible it says either Moses told the follow the pattern or it was made the pattern.
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes a big deal about that God gave essentially blueprints, and Moses did exactly what the blueprints said to do. Most construction workers don't even do that today, right? Like we have very specific, drawn out visual blueprints, and they're like, I think that'll look better over there. Like they'll just kind of pull an audible, and do things the way it makes more sense, because let's be honest, what's on the blueprints isn't always perfect. And what's done because of the blueprints isn't always perfect, right? Like you have to, that's not the case here. What God described was perfect, and what Moses and the artisans did was perfect, because it was exactly how God wanted it. And I do think that is an important point here for us, and that God really wanted them to do it a certain way, and so they did. They didn't, we get a little bit later where we have the story of Nadab and Abihu over in Leviticus and all that, where you've got, we might have a better idea. And that doesn't work out well, right? That's not the case here with the tabernacle. They did it exactly as it was supposed to be done. And that point is really emphasized as you go through this particular text. You look a little bit later. It's over in, now I got to find it. Chapter 40, verse 16. Chapter 40, verse 16. Moses did everything. What's your version say? Okay, according to all that the Lord commanded. Anybody's version say anything different? I just like the way it's worded. CSB, how's CSB read? Okay, Moses did exactly what he was supposed to do, right? And I think that, again, one of the main points in this section is for us to recognize that Moses did what he was supposed to do. He did all that he was supposed to do. He did it exactly like he was supposed to do it. He followed the plan exactly, and that's impressive. One of the reasons I find this impressive is because, as far as we know, there's no actual blueprint. It's a verbal telling of exactly the way this is supposed to be done. And I don't know about you, but for instance, with my kids, I don't know how many times I have to give them the exact same instruction, and they still don't get it right. Right? I mean, we tend to be pretty bad about that. I'm reading a book right now called The Lost World of Scripture. And the entire premise of the book is the difference between the way an oral-based society versus a written-based society functions. And that up until pretty recent modern times, nearly every society has been an oral or oral-based society, that it's based off of speaking and hearing. And there's a certain, there's actually writings back from Greek times and the major philosophers where people would suppose, what would life be like if everything were written down? And most of the philosophers were like, well, that would be a disaster. You know why it would be a disaster if things were written down? People would quit paying attention. They would quit remembering things because they would depend on what was written down. And what's written down isn't necessarily any more reliable than what is remembered. And if anything, it's less reliable because then it's up for interpretation, whereas if it is spoken and heard, you can ask questions, right? And so it makes a lot of arguments for the actual benefit of spoken rules and regulations and instructions versus written rules and regulations and instructions. We don't know how much of this was written down right away. We don't know how much of this, Moses wrote out on scrolls or stone or parchment or any of that sort of stuff. That God didn't just write the 10 Commandments on the stone, but there's a third stone that had an actual blueprint drawing of the rectangular tabernacle. We don't have any of that kind of stuff. I would assume that stuff doesn't exist, right? But here, we read, how many of you read over some of this and your eyes glossed over a little bit with all the details? Anybody else? Okay, it's one of those, yet Moses heard it, memorized it, relayed the information to the artisans, whatever God didn't clarify, maybe in some sort of supernatural, inspirational way. But here, the details that Moses had to pay attention to of exactly what each layer of the curtain and tabernacle tent was made out of, and what layers and what order that all went in, and exactly how long each post had to be, and how many rings and how many details that he had to pay extraordinary attention to, that we read and we're like, oh, let's skim. Right? How many of you found yourself skimming through some of this? And you'd have to stop yourself and be like, all right, nope, let me slow down. I need to pay attention to the detail. I say that to help you recognize how much honor and respect was given to God in the details of the tabernacle. That it wasn't it really makes more sense for there to be 8 rings instead of 6 rings. So we're gonna add that. We just got this weird theme right here. You don't have any of that. It's do it exactly right. And that is a remarkable amount of respect. Keith, and then Dallas.
Biggest sources of debate, discussion, etc. throughout Jewish history has been what counts as work on the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
And in this passage, this lecture scripture in Exodus 35, verse 3, is one of the pieces where I've read the debate go back and forth. Do not light a fire in any of your homes on the Sabbath. I'm sure when Moses first gave that command to the Israelites, it was pretty clear because, like you said, they could go back and forth, have discussion, and things like that. But once that became written down and it became scripture, and Jews and even us now modern day, when we read scripture, we need to take a textualist approach.
Yeah.
We do what the text says. I've got a gas fireplace where in the winter I have a switch.
Yeah.
Is that working? Is that Moses is trying to convey that the fire equals work in every situation, or is he explaining giving an example of something that is readily considered to be work in the context of things? When you're with Moses, you can get that clarification.
Yeah.
When you don't, you get millennia of.
Well, and that's where, for instance, the debate about this verse becomes, okay, is it less work to keep a fire going that you lit the previous day, and you have to get up periodically through the night to keep the fire going? Is that less work than actually lighting the fire in the first place? Well, by the letter of the law, that's acceptable, even though I think probably most of us would argue it's way more work. Right? But the point is, don't work. But now we've got to have that debate. But again, I don't want us to miss the fact of, it could be that debate didn't come from a legalistic, let's see what we can get away with mindset, as much of we want to make sure we're following the rules exactly the same way Moses and the artisans followed the rules exactly in the building of the tabernacle. Right? And so let's not condemn so quickly, which isn't what you're doing. It's one of those, but we do have a tendency to do that, and I think we need to be careful about that. They clearly, at least in this context, worked very diligently to follow the rules exactly as they were laid out. And that is commendable of Moses, the artisans, the children of Israel, and all who were involved in this. Dallas?
Your description about the work that was done and the intricate detail and all of that, and how they obeyed down to the finest detail, speaks to the modern theories that they have discovered the Ark of the Covenant, but it's not really what is said in the Bible. It's some box or some basket or
Yeah.
something else. But the argument against those findings is that they follow the detail.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, these details, you're not going to find a shoddy craftsmanship or some sort of alternative Ark of the Covenant when you see the amount of obedience they gave to the specific rules. Absolutely correct. Keith?
The prophets and the apostles, God put their words into their mouth and they spoke. And I think he did the same thing here with Israel and Korea.
Mhm.
Put that in their hearts, he helped them understand. Because, we had renderings of these things that it looks all different. Everybody's renderings look different. So it would look different, and they would have never been able to do it exactly just by these
Yeah.
instructions. So I believe God put it in their heart.
Yeah, and that very well could be. I mean, I think we need to be careful with our dogmatism on, well, this is how inspiration works. I don't know that because none of us have had the experience that we can really say this is exactly how it works. And again, we don't do that with this as much as I've heard those kind of discussion regarding the Bible in general of inspiration. God put every word in their mind exactly how it was laid down. Yeah, we need to be real careful about that because there are plenty of indications that that's not the case. Now, that by no means lessens the inspiration of the message that we have. But we've got to be very careful about the way we are dogmatic about things we don't quite understand. Like this, I would not be dogmatic that God gave each one of them this visual image of exactly what they were working on. The moment they were working on it, it was like they could flip to a catalog in their head of, okay, that's what God means. And then they're able to do it. Or I'm also not going to be dogmatic that Moses doesn't have more instructions than what is written down, so that there was more conversation that happened, and it wasn't inspiration of the artisans as much as it was Moses able to clarify things. We really don't know. What we do know is that what God intended is what is built, because that's the emphasis here. That's the part we know. And that, I think, is just so important for us, and that even us as people of God today, we have to be careful to build what God intends to be built. So, again, I don't know that we have the same kind of detail about what God intends to be built when it comes to the church versus the tabernacle. I will say this, I think we have comparable detail about how we're supposed to build our lives because we are the tabernacle of God. We tend to use that pattern argument more in regards to authority about the church, and I think we probably should use that pattern argument more in regards to the way we construct our lives. That's just a personal opinion of mine. But I mean, here, I love that in this section, even though our eyes gloss over reading the details, don't miss the fact that theirs didn't. They followed it to a T. And they made sure that what they were doing correctly. I do find it interesting here. We do have this Sabbath command that kind of begins this whole thing. Now, again, remember, this is a continuation of the previous chapter where there are a bunch of rules that are given. And then you've got this little thing about Moses' radiant face and that whole thing happening. But then it goes back into one of the rules, which probably means that the chapter break here is poorly placed. That's just my own personal take on that. But it is interesting here that, the Sabbath is to be respected. There was to be a day of complete rest. Going back to our conversation earlier on the Sabbath. Yes, they had discussions about what does it mean to light a fire and what is more work or less work or those sorts of things. Again, going back to the main point, what was the goal of the Sabbath? Rest to the Lord. Rest for purpose. Okay, and I think sometimes they did get distracted away from the purpose of the Sabbath in order to pursue the rules of the Sabbath. And we need to be careful about that. If our goal is to accomplish the task the Lord has given us, in this case, their goal was complete rest to the Lord. That was the goal. Honestly, that should have been their kind of North Star in any discussion they had about the Sabbath. It's not about what is work and what isn't, and what are the 39 categories of work, and what qualifies as being work within those 39 categories, and is this lifting or is it not lifting, or is this lighting a fire or not lighting a fire, and all these different motions and categories of work they had rules about. Their initial discussion should always have been, can we confidently say this is a complete rest to the Lord? That should have been their guiding light. And I think sometimes there's a lesson in that for us, even in the modern church, of are we truly accomplishing the task the Lord has given us? Or are we more concerned about, is this qualified? Does this qualify? How does this categorize? And all of those kind of things. Get to the work. That get to the purpose, get to what we're supposed to be accomplishing, and most of the discussions and debates will take care of themselves if we get back to what is the actual purpose. Keith? Yeah.
I think this too is leaning toward preparation. It's like math, you got 2 days work on 6 days.
Yeah.
And this is, it's not saying you have a fire. I think you can probably put wood on the fire, but you can't go out and cut the wood, and you're not supposed to kindle the fire. You're supposed to be prepared.
Mm-hmm.
So the fire is that goes back forward, and you just start to do it.
Yeah.
You expect them to freeze to death, and it's just the preparation.
Yeah, and you're probably right. I mean, and ultimately, well, I'm not going to say that because that's probably going too far. But ultimately, I think we have to recognize God isn't trying to hurt them with this law. God is trying to refocus them with this law. And that, why I think it's attached right here on the beginning of the laws about the tabernacle is, remember what you're doing is for the Lord. This isn't about for yourself, for some sort of personal glory, for some sort of national rally activity or anything like that. This is for the Lord. Just like the Sabbath is for the Lord. Just like the law keeping is for the Lord. Make sure that you're back and focusing on those things. The one new piece of this section that you have is this whole contribution aspect. What's interesting about the way they contribute? Okay, so first of all, you've got this free will concept, okay? You go over to, I was reading this in a different Bible. That always throws me off. Verse chapter 35. Do what? Okay, 35, yes, here. Everyone making an offering of silver and bronze brought it as a contribution to the Lord. Everyone who possessed acacia wood was, lost my place, useful for any task of the work brought it. They brought all of these things. The leaders brought onyx and gemstones. So the Israelites, verse 29, brought a free will offering to the Lord, all the men and women whose hearts prompted them to bring something for all the work that the Lord, through Moses, had commanded to be done. Okay, so I find it interesting, that implies not everyone gave, doesn't it? Again, we don't have a list of who did and who didn't. There's not an accounting sheet that says these families gave this much and these families gave this much over here and these families didn't give anything at all. So shame them for the rest of their days. None of that kind of stuff. It's very much a free will offering, but the free will offering, what do we find out about it? Yes, that so much so, chapter 36, verse 4, then all the artisans who were doing the work came one by one from the work they were doing to say to Moses, the people are bringing more than is needed for the construction of the work the Lord commanded to be done. So I find it interesting. Each artisan to the man all came and said, Moses, we got a problem. It's a good problem, but we got a problem. People are bringing too much. And that, to me, is pretty astonishing. That here it's a free will offering. We've got a group of people who live in the wilderness, right? They're not in their homeland yet. They are already stubborn and stupid, because we've already read some stories about that, right? But when Moses says there's a task to be done and we're going to do it with a free will offering, they are so generous that the workers complain. I mean, my suspicion is either they couldn't get the work done because they were constantly interrupted by somebody else bringing stuff and they're having to constantly go, okay, put it over there, put it with the rest of the stuff, right? And that could be a problem. Or they were bringing so much stuff that it was actually preventing them from getting the work done because there wasn't room to do the work, okay? Because I would imagine you're bringing all this gold. You're not bringing gold that is prepared for work. You're bringing gold that now has to be melted down and beaten into sheets that you can use to cover the furniture and those types of things. Or the wood comes and now you've got to stop and I know Randy, about a year ago, I brought the boys over because Randy had gone and gotten a pile of wood from somewhere. Who knows with Randy, he's always getting stuff from somewhere. But he needed the wood brought into his barn and off the trailer, and it needed to be stacked in a certain way, and there needed to be little separator spacers between the different layers of wood and all this kind of stuff. So it's one of those, had he been having that come in on a daily basis, would Randy have ever gotten any of his other work done? No, he'd have to constantly be dealing with the supplies that were coming in, and organizing it and making sure things were in their right places and all of that. I don't know exactly where the problem was. Generally, we're like, man, if we could get surplus, we'd love it, right? Like that's generally the attitude. That's not the attitude here. Okay, we got it. There's too much coming. To the point to where Moses has to, verse 6, give an order and send a proclamation throughout the camp, let no man or woman make anything else as an offering for the sanctuary. Like he essentially had to send out a new rule of stop. That's amazing. Part of what's amazing to me about that is that how many chapters ago was it that they were worshiping a golden idol? Yeah, not many, because they all brought their, and supposedly threw it all in the fire and an idol popped out, right? I mean, again, dumbest excuse in the world. But, and Moses melted that idol's worth of gold down so that they could bang it into sheets and use it for the sanctuary. Is that what he did with it? What did he do with it? Ground it up, made them drink it, okay? That's all gone unless they harvested it on the other side. And I don't think they did, okay? So that's gone. That gold is gone. Yet here they're still getting so much that they have to stop the people. I bring this up for this reason. This is a people who are excited to worship. Part of that enthusiasm took them down the wrong road. Okay, I get that. I get that. Back just a few chapters ago, they were worshiping. They made and worshipped an idol while Moses is up on the mountain. But Moses has gone back up on the mountain, received these instructions, come back down, and he's delivering it to the people. And they are so enthusiastic about worship, about worshiping their God, that now what was already, I mean, how many people went, oh man, I already gave so much for that golden calf and my stomach still hurts from that. You don't see that. These people are excited to worship. And I think there's a great lesson in that. Not just in a lesson of generosity, that's a pretty obvious lesson in this section, but the lesson of how much do we put into our desire to worship. Because these people were willing to essentially do whatever it takes to make worship possible. Again, just an impressive. We have a lot of bad to say about the Israelites, but this is a really good thing to say about them. Keith?
I see a lot of parallels to the world now. I think when you look at human history, just about every group has been excited to worship something.
Mm-hmm.
Even now in 2023, when you look around, I personally think it's true of our neighbors, of our communities, of our country. What they're worshiping may be something that is like religion that we're used to. It may not be some God, it might be science or some belief in being nice to people, or people want something to believe in. And it's not much anything I totally agree. It's not much anything about the Israelite people here in the second scripture. Is they're complete about base from where they were before. It is an amazing model of repentance. I love how the word the scripture uses that anybody whose hearts will move. I see a lesson in evangelism here that if we want to be active in our community, if we want our nation, our people, our neighbors to turn towards God, we turn their hearts.
Yeah.
And that's what's going to lead them to the kind of repentance.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think there's a lesson in that of people don't tend to get excited about rules. They get excited about something bigger than themselves. And when we're out there pandering rules, okay, and what I mean by that is we have it more correct than anybody else. And we're shocked that people aren't like flocking to that. Whereas they're flocking to a more of an emotional appeal that many of the other religious groups are out there making. Whether that be an emotional appeal toward some sort of Protestant understanding of God, the Mormon emotional appeal of, well, just pray and God will let you know. God will put it on your heart that this is truth, those kind of things. That emotional appeal is what tends to sway people. Okay. Now again, I'm not saying we should throw truth aside for the sake of appealing to emotion. Not my point at all. But I do think that there needs to be both sides of the coin in what we are offering to the world. We are concerned about truth. Why? Because we are so connected to or concerned about worshiping and honoring and respecting a God who has given us these commands. And so there can be both sides of that. But yes, I think you're right. The world does tend to want something bigger than themselves. Yeah. Elijah? Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And again, how many parallels exist there of, here, back in Acts chapter 2, they're going to be worshiping in a new way they've never worshiped before, a new understanding of God that they've never had before. There's so many revelations that are attached to Acts chapter 2. The same is true here. They are going to finally have a tabernacle, a place of worship, and a form of worship that they've never known before. One delivered by the very God they're worshiping, right? That is an exciting proposition. That's the thing that they're going to get very excited about. What's interesting, one of the interesting contrasts between the generosity of the Israelites here and the generosity of the Christians in Acts chapter 2, 4, 5, 3. I forgot 3. I can't count. What makes that interesting is the generosity in Acts chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 is focused on what? Do what? Okay, yeah. I would say, and what I mean by that, it's focused on the people, whereas in this case, it's focused on God. Not saying that Acts chapter 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 wasn't also a generosity toward their service toward God, but it is interesting that you've got this new tabernacle. The church is the meeting place. The church is where God dwells, understanding versus here. But the generosity is the same. And I find that, again, to be a pretty interesting parallel between the two. All right, keep going here. We've got not only a description of the tabernacle itself, we've got a description of the furniture pieces within the tabernacle. We have an interesting description of the priestly garments and those pieces that are part of what's going to happen. When you get to the end of chapter 39, you have the inspection that takes place. So they built this thing, they've constructed it, they're ready to go with it because Moses inspects it to make sure that it matches exactly the instructions that he received from the Lord. And then you have the beginning of chapter 40. You are to set up the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, on the first day of the first month. And then essentially God's instructions are put everything in a proper place so that all of this can be consecrated and made ready for my presence. Okay, how long has it been since they left Egypt? Okay, just under a year, right? So we've got, remember, the Passover feast that was going to take place, and that was when God essentially reassigned. This is the first month, right? This is the beginning. And so now I think it's at that point where he reassigns their calendar. And then here, we're going to make all this happen right at the beginning of the year. This is the New Year's Day. God moves into the tabernacle, kind of idea here. So Moses puts all the things in place, and then you skip down to chapter 40, verse 33. Next, Moses set up the surrounding courtyard for the tabernacle and the altar and hung the screen for the gate of the courtyard. So Moses finished the work. The cloud covered the tent of meeting. The glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was unable to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud rested on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. The Israelites set out whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle throughout all the stages of their journey. If the cloud was not taken up, they did not set out until the day it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and there was a fire inside the cloud by night, visible to the entire house of Israel throughout all the stages of their journey. And so here you've got this, again, this idea of God is using this moment, this tabernacle as a way of identifying himself with his people. Because they have followed the rules, they have done what they were told to do, they have honored him in the way that they did it. And so you've got very much a focus on God essentially moving in, right? And I find that to be really interesting in the way that all of this works. So here we've got, any thoughts and questions on all of that? Keith?
One of the things I was thinking was, I think this is tabernacle. The first thing that people have been required to do in relation to God. They've been given laws of what not to do.
Mm-hmm.
But there's been nothing to do listen to Moses, things like that. But physical action, and then, we get all excited about this golden calf. And here we are, okay, let's get gold again, let's give all these things again. They're excited about that. I'm not gonna judge their hearts, so we don't just get their people, really don't know for God. But, I think this kind of, for one, appeals to them. We're gonna give gold, I mean, obviously the gold has something to do with God's, and whether this is gonna be our new God, I don't believe that. But, I just think that's something that they got behind, and it's something now we can do rather than having to let's see what Moses do all this stuff. It's probably kind of antsy, they do nothing, they do the traveling and do their everyday deeds. It really does nothing for God.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that we're trying to get this going.
Yeah. And very well might be. The only thing I can think that maybe would be some sort of sacrifices that are already set, but I'm trying to think back if how much of that has already been established at this point. Not much, if any of it. Yeah. Yeah. It's what, the 15th day of the first month? And so, yeah. So we've got, it is interesting. They've been here at Mount Sinai for what, 9 months or so, I think I think that's about right. So they haven't been here long. I don't know how long the tabernacle itself took to build, because we don't know how long it was that Moses was back and forth on the mountain and all of those details. So there's pieces of this, but clearly not long to build the tabernacle. And then obviously it's something that can be picked up and put together pretty quickly based on the instructions that they'll receive as we start moving forward through the book of Leviticus. So yeah, I mean, that could very well be part of this. Part of the enthusiasm is finally something we can do. And so you've got very much an excitement there to be able to do their part. Ron? Yeah. Seems they ended up taking it for granted most of the time. Like it's again, I'm being judgmental when saying that. Yeah. Oh, I know, and again, we like to think highly of ourselves. Be like, if we had all of those advantages, we most certainly would not have complained or rebelled or done some of the things that the people did. I don't know. We like to talk about their advantages, but I don't know that we realize just how advantageous our situation is and our covenant is in comparison to what they have. I mean, if they wanted forgiveness, they were very limited on that. We want forgiveness, we just pray. Right? And I don't say that flippantly, but I mean, there's a great benefit of we don't have to go to a tabernacle to approach our God in some form or fashion. We are the tabernacle. We get to have that connection with God in a much superior way. But how often do we take that for granted? And just something to. I wonder the same things, Ron. I do wonder the same thing, Keith.
I kind of liken it to take for example about forgiveness. I liken it to the my process going down to high school learning to drive. I had a learner's permit and your license, I had a curfew, got some people in my car, and just as I got older and matured and got a better knowledge and understanding of what I was
Mhm.
Yeah, because of that knowledge, you can't help but love you. And so, to your point, the fact that we can just go to the creator universe, our creator, naturally, is an incredible thing. But I believe it's something that God gave us through the new covenant that was based upon mankind's ability to have that maturity, to understand that authority of what we have been given. In part because we have these stories of Exodus, because we're able to compare to the sacrifices and fruits of the fantastic job of describing those differences and show the new covenant being a better way. But I do think that that's one of the real benefits of understanding the Old Testament very well, is that you're able to better understand the maturity and the progress and greater knowledge, intimacy with the Father that is kind of predicates all of our new covenant.
Yeah. Well, to take your driving illustration a step further, I think the danger part of it is not just we gain more privileges, but we also probably take more advantage of the situation. You know, how many of us drive, how many of us remember how much concentration it took to drive early on? You know, I had that experience when I started driving the school bus, and I had to know I was going to be tested and all that kind of stuff. I really had to pay attention because it was so different. You know, first time you ever drive a moving truck, and you're like, oh, I don't have any wiggle room on this road at all, you know, and like you get used to that. First time you have to back up a trailer, you know, anytime you're doing something new, all of a sudden your concentration and focus becomes so much stronger. But when you do it a lot, or when it becomes easy to take it, you know, to neglect, you know, to not really focus on. And I think sometimes that's true of our worship also. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a sense in which mankind grows up and matures, but we as individuals need to be careful that we don't let those privileges become things that we don't appreciate because of our relationship. So anyway, we are done with the book of Exodus. Like I said, Steve will be doing the book of Leviticus, starting that on Wednesday. I think he's got chapters 1 through 7 on Wednesday, 8 through 10 on next Sunday. So go ahead and read ahead of time so you can be prepared for discussing